our meat brains really work. So, hi, thank you so much for joining me this morning on, as we have discussed, what is a very dreary day. I really appreciate you being here. I want to tell you a little bit about me first. So, I previously worked at both Distilled and Verve Search on PR teams that collectively secured more than 22,000 pieces of linked coverage on sites like this. So, sites that hopefully you will recognize. We created things like this. This is just to give you a bit of context of the sort of work that I used to do. So this is a piece called Daily Routines, and here we explored how some of the world's most loved artists structured their days. This piece got more than 2,000 pieces of linked coverage. The second example I'd like to share with you is a piece called Director's Cut. So here we revealed the films with the highest on-screen death counts. Not a cheery subject, but I think potentially an interesting one. And this achieved more than 500 pieces of linked coverage. Final example I want to share with you today is a piece we did for Lenstore called 24-Hour London. And this was a panoramic gigapixel time-lapse of London's skyline. This achieved more than 150 pieces of linked coverage. So today, I'm now a freelance consultant, and most of the time I work with companies and in-house teams that are making similar things. And pretty much all of the teams I work with have the same goal: to get more consistent results for their clients. Or more accurately, I think, to fail at this stuff less frequently. Now, many people believe that the solution is to create better processes. And yet, all too often, I've observed that the shiny new processes somehow make things worse rather than making them better. So today, I'll be sharing a story about my struggle to implement a particular digital PR process. And I'm doing this, as I said before, because digital PR is my jam. It's what I do day to day. But actually, this isn't really a talk about digital PR. It's a talk about human beings and the strange ways that our brains work. This is largely what I'll be covering today. It's a talk about how we interpret and make sense of things, how we process new information, and what we remember and what we don't. Ultimately, I hope I will approach giving you an answer as to why it is those shiny new processes, which we hope solve all our problems, rarely do. So I'm hoping that there will be useful things in here regardless of the discipline you work in. So let's just kick off straight away and go to part one: how we interpret and make sense of things. So when I first start working with a new client, there's a question that I love to ask. Why do you think this PR piece was successful? Now, in an ideal world, I'll ask about a piece they actually created, but you can ask this question about any successful piece. But why do I care about this question? Well, I ask it because I found that it reveals a huge amount about how individuals and the team as a whole think. Now, this is hard to explain in the abstract, so I'm just going to share an example. I would like, if I may, to take you back in time to 2015. This piece, Every Country's Most Popular Beer, was created by a company called VinePair. And at the time I was working at Distilled. And a bunch of us there at Distilled were really fascinated by the success of this piece. We saw it had got a huge amount of coverage across a huge amount of high-tier press publications. And we couldn't really figure out why. Because we weren't involved with this piece. We were just kind of looking at it from afar, I guess. So back then, we used to use Google Plus as our internal discussion or chat platform. Now we'd use something like Slack, but Slack didn't exist back then. So we were using Google Plus. And this is actually a screen grab from our Google Plus back then. So Will Critchlow is the CEO of Distilled, or was the CEO of Distilled. And this is what he had to say about the piece. He said, "I saw this in a few places and was also puzzled by how it was so popular. I didn't really get what all the fuss was about, except, beer." Now, I don't think that beer was the reason that piece was successful. And Will really doesn't think that either. We know this, I think, because if beer were the reason that that piece was successful, then every digital PR piece about beer would be successful. And that's definitely not the case. I've launched many digital PR campaigns about beer, which were not successful, or at least not as successful as that piece. So beer is not the reason. And the problem is not that sometimes we think these things. Actually, the problem is that we don't realize that we think like this. Now, this happens due to something called sense making. Sense making is the process by which people give meaning to their collective experiences. And how does it manifest? Well, I think something like this. When thinking about why a piece was successful, or why anything was successful, we often jump quickly to an explanation that sounds plausible, but isn't accurate. But we move on. We move on so quickly that we kind of fail to consider how accurate or otherwise our explanation might be. And it's problematic because sense making is not just how individuals make sense of things. Sense making is how organizations or groups of people make sense of things. You might have heard this referred to as something like groupthink. And I think groupthink or sense making is often the reason why groups of people can make bad decisions sometimes. It's not thought. So another important thing to note about sense making is that it's social activity. So plausible stories are preserved, retained, and shared. And these plausible but inaccurate stories affect the way we interpret future events, not just as individuals, but as groups. So I want to give you an example of this, hopefully to clarify it for you. So when we accept at some level that beer is the reason that this piece is successful, what happens when we see another successful digital PR piece about beer? Well, I think something like this happens in our heads. So we see a successful piece. We conclude beer is the reason it's successful. Then we see another successful piece and we notice it's about beer too. Something kind of goes off in our heads and we're like, there's a pattern here. And then all future successful pieces we encounter about beer add evidence to support this explanation. And in effect, this connection, this idea that beer is the reason that this piece is successful, for us internally becomes more and more and more true over time, the more evidence we gather that this is really the case. Now, I see this happening in a lot of directions at once. What else do those two pieces have in common? Well, they're both maps. Both of them are maps. And this is another sort of pattern which I see people kind of recognizing often. But again, it isn't true. Because if the fact that it was a map was the reason that it was successful, then every map-based piece would be successful. And again, that's definitely not the case. Now, there are actually two things happening at the same time here. So we have sense making and we also have pattern recognition. So I want to talk a little bit about pattern recognition. So human beings are programmed to spot patterns and we're pretty great at spotting them. And actually, it's very, very useful to us. So our ability to spot patterns allows us to detect both hazards and resources. And actually, our continual survival relies on some types of pattern recognition. So pattern recognition is not something that you can just shut off or stop doing, because we actually rely on it for survival. So pattern recognition allows us to make these sorts of determinations. So like, is it safe to cross the street? When you're deciding whether or not to cross the street, you're using pattern recognition, essentially, to identify where the gap in traffic is or whether there's a sufficient gap in the traffic to allow you to cross the road safely. In a similar vein, when you're deciding whether or not those berries are safe to eat, you're using a type of pattern recognition there too. So pattern recognition is undoubtedly a really useful ability, but actually our ability to spot patterns doesn't always serve us well because the patterns we identify aren't always meaningful. Now this is called apophenia, and apophenia is the tendency to perceive meaningful connections between unrelated things. And over the course of time, apophenia has also come to describe the human propensity to unreasonably seek patterns in random information. So we all do this pretty much all of the time, and we do it unconsciously. So here are some examples of apophenia. This is my favorite one, gambler's fallacy. So if you toss a coin 10 times and it comes up heads every single time, what are the odds that the next coin toss will come up tails? Well, those of you who understand probability will rationally say to me, the odds don't change. It's still 1 in 2, even though heads has come up 10 times. Now, whilst we might rationally know that this is true because we have an understanding of probability, nevertheless, I feel like our brains don't quite believe it. And you can kind of see this manifesting. So if you toss a coin 10 times and it comes up heads every time, there's something in you that goes, it's got to be tails next, though. Like, what are the odds of it keeping on being heads? And of course, rationally, we know the odds of it keeping on being heads are just still 1 in 2. But somehow what we're doing is we're connecting these events. Each coin toss is a separate event, completely unrelated from the previous coin toss or any subsequent coin toss. But we struggle with that. We struggle to kind of to deal with that in our minds. We want to link those events. Some of you, and I'm really hoping this is the case, if so, please let me know in the chat. Some of you might see this pepper and perceive it to be screaming in agony. If that's what you see when you see this image of the pepper, what you've got there is pareidolia. Now, pareidolia is another type of apophenia, and it's our tendency to see faces within inanimate objects. This is another interesting, I think it's a really interesting phenomena. There are some theories as to why it is we have a tendency to see faces. And one of them, which I kind of like, is really, again, strongly linked to survival. It is useful for us, for our continued survival, potentially, to notice faces or perhaps perceive faces even when they aren't there, because faces could be threats, right? It's about recognition of potential dangers. So that's super interesting. Final example, conspiracy theories, right? When we weave coincidences together into an elaborate plot, things which aren't related, we think they are, and we create ourselves sometimes quite a strange and altered view of reality. So, as I said before, we all have a tendency to seek to draw meaning from the patterns we perceive. And there are also some industry-centric examples of apophenia. So this is an example from the world of SEO, search engine optimization. I've heard people say things like long articles rank better than short ones. So what do I mean by that? A long article will often appear to outrank perhaps a shorter article in the search engine results pages. Now, whilst that might appear to be the case in some instances, do those articles really rank well just because they're long? Probably not, right? Like, we can't just take an existing article, add, I don't know, 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 words to it and just expect it to rank better because it's longer, right? That's not really the reason why long articles rank better than short ones. The length is probably neither here nor there. Here's an example of PR apophenia, which I hear a lot. Journalists love those dream job stories. So what do I mean by a dream job story? You probably have seen them all the time, right? Companies kind of devise these crazy jobs, in inverted commas, which probably aren't real jobs, but you might be like a hot tub tester, for example, might be someone's dream job. And what happens is digital PRs like me, we send out press releases about those things, and dream jobs do tend to get coverage. I've definitely seen a lot of dream jobs covered, but not every dream job story is covered. Journalists do not write up every dream job story that comes across their desk. It's another type of apophenia. So, like I said before, humans are great at spotting patterns, but we find it much harder to distinguish whether or not those patterns are meaningful. And as a result, our ability to spot patterns doesn't always serve us well. So, we've got patterns like this, patterns like beer, patterns like map as a reason for something being successful. Now, patterns like beer and map are very obviously not meaningful, right? PR pieces are not successful because they're about beer or because they're maps. But nevertheless, at some level, even at a subconscious level, the vast majority of the digital PRs I've worked with have absorbed patterns like these. And they've absorbed them even if they recognize that beer or map, like those aren't the reasons that those pieces were successful. And I think regardless of the type of work you do, there will be similar meaningless patterns that you've absorbed. things that on some level you believe to be true, but they aren't. And that's why I love asking this question. Why do you think this PR piece was successful? I ask it because it allows me to quickly understand which erroneous patterns have been absorbed by the team as a collective. And this is really important because if I don't fully understand the things that people currently misunderstand, I'm going to struggle to help them at all. But once I understand the things that people misunderstand and devise a shiny new process, my problems are over, right? No, absolutely not. So part 2, how we process new information. So I said before that pretty much all of the PR teams I work with have the same goal: to get more consistent results for their clients, or more accurately, to fail less frequently. And that this is the question that I'm most asked most frequently. This piece generated a bunch of coverage a few years ago. Could we remake it? Now, remaking or remixing existing PR pieces is very common practice, and I don't think there's anything wrong with that. Actually, the 3 pieces I showed you right at the beginning of this talk are all either remakes or remixes. So daily routines, this piece that I showed you at the beginning, here we've explored how some of the world's most loved artists structured their days. Prior to us creating this piece, there were other similar pieces to this in existence. They weren't exactly the same as this. So for example, there was definitely a piece out there which explored sleep. So how and when famous creative people slept, whether it was at night or whether it was during the day, whether they took naps and so on. There was another piece out there about when famous creative people did their creative work. So at what point in the day did they do their creative work, because that was when they were, when they felt they were most productive, right? So whilst this precise incarnation of this piece didn't exist, we created it. Things like it did exist prior to us making this. In a similar vein, this piece, Director's Cut, where we revealed the films with the highest on-screen death counts, there was a piece in existence prior to this. It used a slightly different data set, and it was old, so the winner was different. So for us, when we did our analysis of this, Guardians of the Galaxy was the film with the highest on-screen death count. For those of you who are interested, 83,871 on-screen deaths in that film. Guardians of the Galaxy wasn't the winner of the original piece that looked at this, because Guardians of the Galaxy hadn't even been launched in cinemas then. So, but yeah, the piece existed. The piece existed before we did it. And finally, this piece, the panoramic gigapixel time-lapse. Now, this was the first panoramic gigapixel time-lapse of London's skyline. That is true. It was like a first in that sense. But big pictures of London, big high-resolution pictures of London have existed for an awful long time. BT did one for the Olympics, for the London Olympics. They took this huge picture of London from the BT Tower. So whilst this exact incarnation of the piece hadn't existed before, lots of things which were a bit like it did exist. So the tricky thing is, obviously, I've just shown you 3 examples of remakes or remixes that have performed brilliantly well. But of course, not all remakes and remixes do perform like this. And as such, the process I most frequently implement is this. Essentially, it's how to get a better answer to this question. Should we remake this piece? Now, the truth is, remakes fail when we're unable to recreate the conditions which led to the success of the original piece. So in order to figure out whether or not we should remake something, we first need a clear understanding of why the original was successful. And of course, we need to arrive at a better answer than beer or map or some other pattern that we've recognized. We need to avoid our tendency to slip into pattern recognition mode. And I think one way to do that is to ask better questions. So rather than asking why was this piece successful, I recommend answering these 6 questions instead. So first and foremost, it's about stories, right? So the first question you want to answer is, what stories did journalists write when they covered this piece? And within that, these are some other things you might want to look at. So you might want to look at breaking news. So did the piece feed into something else which was going on in the news cycle? And actually, was it the breaking news that fueled a lot of the coverage of the digital PR piece. Another thing to look at is waves of coverage. So were there waves of coverage? Did it start out small and then something else happened which sparked another wave, and then something else happened which sparked another wave? So it's not just were there waves of coverage, but what caused those waves? The other thing we want to look at are emotions. So what emotions did the coverage provoke? How did people feel about these stories? Other nice things which I like to look at are verticals. So what verticals or types of publication covered this? And finally, I look at countries. So did the piece get coverage in multiple countries? And if so, why? So once we have a clear understanding of why the original piece was successful, what we then need to do is to check whether or not those original conditions are still alive and well. And ultimately, we do that by looking at what the journalists we plan to target are writing about right now. So, for example, if we go back in time, there was a point in time where virtually anything that was like 3D printed kind of sparked a bit of coverage. And it was because at the time, 3D printing was a new technology and people were excited about it. If you did some sort of piece that was largely reliant on you creating something with a 3D printer today, it probably wouldn't get coverage because journalists aren't writing about 3D printing anymore. They've moved on, right? We're now writing about things like possibly about AI, large language models, ChatGPT, that kind of thing. And that's what we're seeing now. So these things are really important for us to understand. So I've got a new process. I've got my list of 6 questions. All I need to do is implement this process, right? Well, you know what? Most of the time, this process I created isn't adopted. This is what normally happens. So people follow the new process for a bit, but quite quickly things start to slide. So in the early days, people do a really good job of answering this question. So I said before, like the first question you want to answer is, what stories did journalists write when they covered this piece? And I'm going to use Every Country's Most Popular Beer, this piece by VinePair, to kind of talk about how you might answer this question well. So like in the early days, what I would see is some things like this. So there are a bunch of different types of stories written about this piece. So there was coverage designed to provoke outrage at the most popular beers. And the reason for that is, you know, beers like Bud Light are the best selling in the United States. We don't do much better in the UK. Our best selling beer in the UK is Carling. And people are kind of outraged at this. They're embarrassed that these are the most, these are the best selling beers, the most popular beers in every country. So there's some coverage like this. Then in business publications, we were seeing coverage like this. This is a piece in the Washington Post. And what this actually is analysis on the 2 major brewers, InBev and SAB Miller, who own most of these beers. So really, this is a piece about the globalization of beer, right? And we saw lots of analysis pieces like this. Finally, in travel, we saw lots of nostalgic travel stories where travel journalists were essentially using this piece as a jumping off point to talk about particular beers that they had tasted when they were off on their travels and their memories of both the travel or the trip itself and the beer. I love this quote, actually. This is from a travel piece in The Economist. And the journalist says, I discovered that Skol was still going strong in Brazil. Of course, it tasted somewhat more pleasant at sunset on Ipanema Beach than it did in rainy West London. And I think this is like just a really interesting observation generally, like how the stuff we drink on holiday, the drinks we drink on holiday, sometimes we'll bring some back, right? And it never tastes the same at home. And I think it's to do with possibly like the experience of drinking that drink abroad is wildly different to our rainy West London flats, which is what I'm in today. So this is what we have initially. Initially, we have people answering this question really thoroughly and really digging into the different types of coverage the original piece got. But then quite soon after, it's like stuff regresses and people are answering this in a really, really unhelpful way. So they're suddenly answering this question like this. So they're saying when journalists covered this piece, they wrote stories about beer, which is directionally true. Those stories were all about beer, but they were also about a lot more than that, right? And essentially what's happening is we're going backwards. So initially the process works pretty well and people seem to be adopting it. But quite quickly what happens is like pattern recognition kicks back in and we stop following the process. So why is that? Well, in part one of this talk, I spent a bunch of time telling you about both pattern recognition and sense making. I showed you that the beer and map patterns, which are pretty easy to debunk. But the trouble is those patterns and others like them are encoded in our brains. And me telling someone that a pattern they've identified isn't the reason a piece was successful doesn't actually fix this, even if they believe I'm right and the thing they previously believed was wrong. Now, this is called the continued influence effect, and it's why false information gets stuck in our brains. So when information is encoded into memory and then new information that discredits it is learned, the original information is not simply erased or replaced. Misinformation and corrective information coexist and compete for activation. So me just telling someone that something isn't true isn't enough, even if they believe me, because the patterns they've absorbed are foundational to their understanding of what works and what doesn't. And any attempt to remove that information could cause everything to collapse. And so like their brain holds on to it really tightly. So false information sticks. And I think this is part of the reason why the processes we try to implement often fail. And a few years ago, I realized that actually my approach to this was all wrong. So I thought that what I was trying to do was implement a process, but actually I was trying to teach people something new. And it's not just me that makes this mistake. I see lots of people make this mistake, right? We all think we're just trying to implement a process and it shouldn't be that hard to get people to follow it. But in reality, we're trying to teach people something new. Now, this might feel like a subtle distinction, but here's why I think we need to acknowledge this, right? What we remember and what we don't. So once we acknowledge we're actually trying to teach people something, as opposed to just getting them to implement something, it forces us to consider how people really learn, which is uncomfortable because the truth is we forget most of what we learn. Many people think that's okay because the stuff that we really need stays with us, but I'm not convinced that's the case. So I have a little confession for you. I can never remember which of these symbols means greater than. I can never remember. I always have to Google it. Now I use these symbols pretty frequently, so why doesn't that very useful knowledge stick with me? I don't know. And I don't just forget stuff like that. On several occasions, I found myself desperately Googling some half-remembered thing, only to find that the thing that I was looking for was an article I wrote. Now, plenty of the stuff I've learned over the years wasn't that useful, and I'm fine with my brain dumping that stuff, but my brain has also dumped a bunch of stuff which was useful. And then to add insult to injury, at the same time, it's kept hold of a bunch of stuff which isn't useful, like the lyrics to Ice Ice Baby, which I remember, even though they are useless and unhelpful. I remember those lyrics. So why do we remember some things but forget others? Like no one really knows. But this leads me neatly to my next point, which is another uncomfortable one. You will forget almost everything I said today. You'll forget it even if you want to recall it. You'll forget it because your brain is wired for pattern recognition, because false information sticks, and because your brain fails to hold on to most of what you learn. Oh, and there's an additional problem. Communication is lossy. Getting information from one body into another is the hardest thing any of us ever does in our work lives. It's also the thing we do all day long, often without a lot of attention or intention. All communication involves some amount of signal loss. Some information or context or sentiment or all three is distorted or lost as one person communicates to another. These are both quotes from Mandy Brown. I've included a link to the article that these quotes are from. If you're interested in this topic, I would strongly recommend you read this article. So What's the problem with communication? Well, it's another interesting problem, right? Because right now, I'm communicating with you in just about the worst possible way. I'm talking at you, not to you. If you don't understand something I've said, you can't ask me. This isn't a conversation. You're not able to contribute actively in any way at all. Maybe you're hungry. Maybe you're worried about that client. Maybe you're just otherwise distracted because you're thinking about something else, or you're just a bit undercaffeinated. All of these things could be true. And actually, this is awful for you. Paying attention to me is really hard for you right now. And it's not just paying attention to me that's hard. Paying attention to anyone is really, really hard. And it's not just one of these things that's a problem, it's all of them. And this is actually just how human meat brains roll. In order to have any hope of doing my job even halfway as competently, I need to acknowledge all of these things. And if any part of your job involves any kind of process implementation or teaching, you need to acknowledge these things too. So what can we do about all this stuff? Well, there are no easy answers, but in my experience, the following things can help. So we need to remember that we're not implementing new processes. We're teaching people something new. And to teach people something new, we need to acknowledge how our own brains work and also how their brains work too. So I acknowledge and accept this about myself. My brain is wired for pattern recognition. My meat brain will always fire off in this direction first, which is okay, as long as I'm able to acknowledge that the patterns which I tend to spot aren't meaningful. In this talk, I've spoken quite a bit about the patterns which we have a tendency to think are meaningful but aren't. And there's a danger in doing this, right? I might actually be reinforcing those connections for you. But actually, I feel like the more I say this stuff out loud, the sillier it sounds. So the more frequently I say, this digital PR piece was successful because it was a map, or this digital PR piece was successful because it was about beer. Like, it sounds silly. It sounds very obviously untrue. And actually, I think pattern recognition is maybe more dangerous when it's unspoken and unconscious. When we vocalize it, it sounds silly even to our own ears. I also acknowledge and accept this stuff about myself. False information sticks in my head. Any new information which I try to absorb will take time to be encoded. The old, incorrect information will compete with the new information. I now expect stuff like this to happen, and that's why I'm telling you about it. Because if I tell you that it happens to me, I feel like you might stand a better chance of recognizing when it's happening to you. I acknowledge and accept this about myself. My brain fails to hold on to most of what I learn, even the useful stuff. I can never remember which of these symbols means greater than, and yet I'm able to remember the lyrics to Ice Ice Baby. Most of the time, when I see a successful piece, here's what happens in my brain. Yet another bloody map that got loads of coverage. Most of the time, I forget my own processes. Again, I'm telling you that this happens to me in the hope that it will help you recognize when it's happening to you. Finally, I acknowledge and accept that communication is lossy, which means I need to be much more mindful about how I communicate stuff. So presentations like this and documentation have their place. But if you're trying to teach someone something new, asynchronous communication sucks. Now, I know that advocating for conversation or synchronous communication is deeply unfashionable. And it's true that a lot of meetings could and should be emails. But knowledge doesn't transfer well via email or via pre-recorded video, even when people read those emails and watch the videos. And actually, I don't think we should be aiming to transfer knowledge at all. I think our aim ought to be to generate it. Now, conversations are active exchanges. They allow new things to emerge. By their very nature, conversations are generative. They go far beyond delivery. So now, whenever I'm implementing a new process, or more accurately, teaching people to do new things, I do so via conversations. Open exchanges where people can voice their concerns and share their experiences. And I'm aware that I'll often need to have the same conversation over and over and over again. Now, this used to frustrate me, but now I just accept that this is how our meat brains work. I can't change the way my brain works, and neither can you. Ignoring this stuff won't solve anything, but acknowledging and accepting that this is how our brains work just might. It's almost time for me to wrap this thing up. Earlier, I said that this was a talk about how we interpret and make sense of things, how we process new information, what we remember and what we don't, and why those shiny new processes, which we hope will solve all our problems, rarely do. So what have we learned? How do we interpret and make sense of things? Well, our default mode is not deep thought. Human beings are unthinking creatures. Most of the time, we don't think. How do we process new information messily? False information sticks in our brains. What do we remember and what do we forget? We forget most of it. We forget most of what we learn, even the stuff we want to remember. I used to think I was trying to implement new processes. Now I acknowledge that what I'm doing is teaching people something new. And it's perhaps a subtle shift in mindset, but it's been really helpful for me. In the past, I used to spend a lot of time considering my messaging and language, the frameworks, models, and processes themselves, and how to make things memorable, in inverted commas. Now, rather than trying to make things memorable, I directly address our tendency to forget, and I talk openly about it. Next time you're trying to teach someone a new thing, I'd strongly encourage you to do the same. Our meat brains don't work the way we think they work.